Hi there, I am Lindsay with Inside the Hem, and today I am going to be covering a variety of different seams that you can be using in your garments. Now, you might be familiar with some of the seams that I have illustrated here. First up, we have just our plain seam. The plain seam is just as you would imagine. It is your fabric sewn right sides together at your desired seam allowance, and then both of the seam allowances pressed open for a beautiful clean finish on the right side of your garment. The next seam, also pretty basic, but this is called the top stitch seam, and it's sewn the exact same way as the plain seam. However, there's one final step, and that is top stitching your seam allowances down to the fabric so that they do not move around and they are not loose from the fabric like they are in the plain seam. In the top stitching seam, they are top stitched down, they're not going anywhere. Finally, I also have the flat felled seam, which you might be familiar with. The flat felled seam is a little bit more advanced than the other three that I have here, but probably something that you've definitely come across in your sewing pattern instructions or online tutorials. But you sew your seam allowances, or you sew your fabric right side together, trim away the seam allowances, and then turn them right sides together again, and top stitch, and that is what produces your flat fell seam. Now, the seam allowances that I'm going to be demonstrating today are those that might be a little less familiar to you. I wanted to pull out some ones that are going to be incredibly useful, but that you just might not have heard of before. So our very first one is called the narrow seam. And the narrow seam, as you can see from the wrong side of the garment, is going to be perfect for those garments that have a lot of wear, those seams that take a lot of the brunt of your wearing, whether that is a shoulder seam, whether that is an inseam of the leg, maybe some kind of pocket, a cuff is a really good example, something that's going to take a lot of use. And the reason why this seam is so great is because from the right side, it looks a lot like the plain seam does, but it is reinforced on the inside, and that is what makes it such a great seam. So I'm going to show you just how easy it is to use this at the sewing machine. I have my machine prepared with an all-purpose thread because the fabric that I'm using is an all-purpose type of fabric. If you're using a fabric that's a little bit heavier weight than this, you might want to go a little bit heavier with your thread, but the all-purpose is really going to cover a large variety of fabrics with this sturdy, strong seam. So over to the sewing machine we go. I've got a turquoise thread in the top and a hot pink thread in the bobbin so that you can see really easily what the stitches are doing with this particular seam. I also have my machine set to a multi-stitch zigzag, and that is what is going to produce that reinforced stitch. So you just place it at your seam allowance. I'm going to be going with a 5/8 inch seam allowance today, and keep in mind that the multi-point zigzag is going to be sewing into the seam allowance slightly, but it should maintain your 5/8 inch just fine. All right, let's do it. Okay, and we'll clip our threads and remove our fabric from our machine. You can see you have this beautiful stitch here. We are going to head to our iron, and the seam allowances get pressed to one side. Ideally, you would be using matching thread in your bobbin as well as your the top of your thread, so it shouldn't matter too much, but you know, you always want to press toward the back or follow the instructions when you can. Okay, so we have them pressed to one side like this. The very last step is just to trim away these seam allowances really, really close to the little tips of our peaks here, being careful to not cut through anything. And once you get this trimmed away, that is it. You have your really super strong, really reinforced seam that is going to be perfect for all of your seams that take a lot of the brunt of the work whenever you wear them. So next up, we have something called the hairline seam. This is one of my favorite seams, especially on lightweight sheer fabrics. This one is going to be beautiful. You can see from the right side that I did use a contrasting fabric or a contrasting thread, so you can see that ever so slightly, but obviously yours would match and would blend in beautifully. But what you cannot see, and this is the real game changer about a hairline seam, is that you cannot see the seam allowance itself. And that's because the seam allowance is trimmed away almost to nothing, but the seam itself is still very, very strong. So in order to execute a hairline seam, it's actually quite simple. You need to place your fabric right sides together, and we are being very careful because obviously this is a sheer fabric. It's very slippery, very shifty. You are going to want to use lots and lots of pins whenever you do this. So placing pins all along your seam allowance. We are going to be using a 5/8 inch seam allowance today, as with most garments. And then the next step is you're going to take either a top stitching thread, or I like to use a button and craft thread. Both of those threads are going to be a little bit thicker than your regular all-purpose, but you want to cut a piece of thread that is going to be longer than the seam that you are going to be sewing. And we are going to take this to our sewing machine. In the sewing machine, I have switched from the all-purpose thread over to a fine thread because we are using such a lightweight fabric. So fine thread in the sewing machine, and I'll meet you over there. Okay, at the machine, I have got my fabric under the presser foot, and I have my machine set to a very narrow zigzag stitch. This is going to be your standard zigzag on the machine, but you want to ping down the width down to 1 millimeter. That's going to produce a very, very narrow zigzag, and you can adjust the length to however you want. The idea is to do the zigzag over top of this buttonhole or top stitching thread. So you want to go very slowly, especially in the beginning. Take your time just to make sure that your needle is hitting both the left and the right side of the buttonhole thread as you sew the seam. And as I'm sewing, I'm kind of just pulling the thread a little bit taut to help keep it as straight as possible as the needle goes over either side of it. Okay, we are going to stop there and not totally sew the entire seam because I think you kind of get the idea, but you can tell that the buttonhole thread, the thicker thread is the white, and then my machine thread is black. So you can see those little black stitches going across the top of the buttonhole thread. And then on the other side of your fabric, there is just the bobbin thread, which is the hot pink. So from here, you would need to trim down your seam allowances, and you're trimming them very, very close to your stitches, almost enough to make you nervous because you really do not want any of those seam allowances to show through on the right side when you turn your fabric out. And you can see here how beautiful that seam line ends up being. Now again, your top stitching or buttonhole thread will match your fabric, so you shouldn't see any of that there. Okay, moving on, the last seam that we are going to talk about today is the lapped seam. And the lapped seam is extra good for fabrics like synthetic leather or suede, or in this case, a ponte knit. And it's great because those fabrics can tend to be a little bit difficult to press, but they can also produce a really bulky seam. So the lapped seam is going to reduce bulk and also eliminate any need for pressing at all. So the first step for the lapped seam is for you to draw in your seam allowance on one piece of your fabric. And then you're going to take some kind of glue or tape and apply that to within the seam allowances. You don't need to do a lot, just a little bit. And then just as the name implies, we are going to lap one over the other like so. And the glue is going to help hold those two in place. We're going to cover that seam line ever so slightly. And then I'm going to take this to the sewing machine. I am going to switch to a stretch thread because I'm working with a stretch fabric. And I'm going to be sewing my first row of stitches right at the very edge of this raw edge. Okay, at the machine, I've got my fabric. You can tell it's holding together really well with that little bit of glue that I used. We are going to be using just a straight stitch on this, and you want to set it so that it is stitching just 1/4 of an inch, maybe even 1/8 of an inch away from that raw edge. I've got some lime green stretch thread in the top and white in the bottom, so we're going to be able to see both of these stitches really well. And then once you've got your initial seam sewn, you are going to sew 1/4 of an inch away from that stitch to have a double row of stitches. And when you are done, you have a beautiful seam that is nice and strong, that did not require any pressing at all, and it is very thin and not bulky considering how thick this ponte knit is. So to recap, the most important thing is to find a seam that is best for your particular project and your particular fabric, and to find a thread that is going to give you perfect results.